Hello, friends. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into one of history's most mysterious ancient conspiracies, the real kind. Not aliens or secret pyramids, but emperors terrified of prophets, generals accused of betrayal, whole religions outlawed for thinking the wrong thoughts in the wrong century. From Rome to Persia, Athens to Egypt, every chapter we explore peels back another layer of fear disguised as justice. Because when power feels threatened, it doesn't argue, it rewrites. So if you've ever wondered what happened behind the marble walls and beneath the golden crowns, what was silenced, suppressed, or burned alive, this is where you'll find it. If that's your kind of story, tap subscribe, follow along. There's more beneath the surface than anyone wants to admit. And ask yourself, when the truth was dangerous, who dared to speak it? Let's find out. You're standing in the middle of Athens, and the year is 415 BC. The sun is already clawing at your skin. The scent of olives mingles with the sour tang of sweat. And somewhere nearby, a group of merchants is loudly arguing over the price of figs. You were meant to be running an errand, picking up bread, maybe exchanging a few sharp words about the latest assembly vote, then heading home. Just another forgettable day in the teeming, chaotic democracy that is your city. But today something feels wrong. It's too quiet, not a holy day quiet, not a lazy summer lull, a strange, suffocating kind of stillness. The chatter is gone. The market buzz has been replaced by a hush so thick it presses against your temples. You don't hear it as much as you feel it. This tension that clings to every building, every passerby. People aren't talking, they're watching. And then you see why. There on the corner where the stone path splits, stands one of the city's many herms, those familiar squat stone markers topped with the stoic head of Hermes and adorned always with an unmissable, erect phallus. It's meant to bring luck, fertility, divine favour. Something between a talisman and a traffic sign. You've seen it 1,000 times. Except now, it's defaced. The nose is gone. The god's calm face has been chiselled into a blank grimace, and the proud phallus reduced to a jagged stump. You stare at it for too long, then keep walking, fast now, heart beginning to thud, with a pressure that doesn't quite have a name. You find another herm, same destruction, then another, and another. By the time you reach the agora, it is no longer a suspicion. It is a fact. The herms across the entire city have been mutilated. It seems absurd at first, like some drunken prank carried too far. But this is not a place where the gods are taken lightly. This is Athens. Land of reason, sure, but also land of omens, land of signs, land of rituals so embedded in public life that a sneeze at the wrong moment in court can reverse a verdict. And the herms, they aren't art, they're sacred. Their placement isn't aesthetic, it's cosmological. The gods watch through them, protect through them. Their destruction isn't vandalism, it's sacrilege, and worse, it might be something more. Something planned, coordinated, political. You see it in the way the elders are whispering behind sleeves. You hear it in the clipped words of the market women, in the way every shopkeeper glances up each time someone enters. This isn't just fear of divine retribution. It's the prickling, skin-deep dread that settles in a city when people start asking, who did this? And more importantly, why now? The timing is catastrophic. Athens is on the verge of launching its most ambitious military endeavour in living memory, an enormous expedition to Sicily. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, a civic investment so vast it could tip the scales of power for generations. And now, this. The mutilated herms seem to mock the whole effort. A curse before departure, a warning etched in stone. Something about it feels intentional. Someone wanted this moment spoiled. Someone wanted panic. and Athens obliges. In a city where every citizen thinks like a lawyer and every rumour is cross-examined by breakfast, suspicion does not spread slowly. It leaps. Within hours, the theory is everywhere. This wasn't the work of drunks or vandals. It was deliberate, organised, a signal. People start murmuring about aristocrats, about secret meetings, about shadowy cabals that want to destroy democracy and replace it with something more traditional. The sort of quiet tyranny that nostalgia always sells as stability. There is no evidence. There doesn't need to be. A few broken statues, a few shaken citizens, and Athens begins to devour itself. Not with riots, with glances, with lists, with names whispered and remembered. Soon there's a consensus forming, not official, not declared, but deeply felt. Someone is behind this, someone powerful, someone theatrical enough to turn a citywide act of blasphemy into a political masterstroke. And in this fevered atmosphere, where every conversation now doubles as an interrogation, one name keeps surfacing, over and over. Alcibiades, the golden boy, the general, the seducer of crowds, and defiler of expectations. Too brilliant, too beautiful, too dangerous. His charisma was once intoxicating. Now it feels suspicious. Because if anyone could charm an assembly into war and then charm the gods into silence, it would be him. You remember his Olympic chariots, all 7 of them, racing under his name, his silver-dripping tunic gleaming in the sun. You remember the speeches that whipped crowds into war-hungry frenzies, the impassioned cries for glory, and the way he could pivot from laughter to wrath without missing a beat. Now that memory curdles. Now it feels like a mask. The whispers become louder. Not in volume, but in certainty. People begin to speak of him not as a suspect, but as a symbol of arrogance, of impiety, of ambition so blinding it would desecrate the gods themselves to seize control. He isn't just a scapegoat. He's an ideal villain, too grand to ignore, too flawed to protect. And as the Athenian fleet prepares to sail, with Alcibiades aboard as one of its commanders, the city behind him tightens its grip around the idea that their golden child may have already betrayed them. But Alcibiades isn't just a pretty face with political flair. He's a survivor, a manipulator, a man who plays the long game. Even now, as he boards the flagship and basks in the cheers of soldiers heading towards Sicily, he surely knows the cheers don't echo back home. He surely senses the murmurs. Then the dagger twist. Just weeks into the expedition, a fast ship arrives with shocking news. Alcibiades is recalled to Athens, officially to stand trial, unofficially to be sacrificed to public fury. The very crowd that crowned him hero is now ready to hang his name beside the shattered Hermes. Except Alcibiades, being Alcibiades, doesn't return. He slips away. Defects to Sparta, offers them advice, offers them Athenian secrets, and just like that, the paranoia of the people becomes prophecy. Their fear made real, and so the affair of the Hermes, beginning with broken statues and ending with a rogue general and a floundering war effort, becomes one of the most destructive conspiracy theories in ancient history. Not because it was true, but because it was believed. Because sometimes a theory doesn't need proof to change everything. It only needs fear. And fear, in ancient Athens, was always in supply. Let's follow the smoke now. Not from burnt statues or temples, but from incense rising through the halls of Babylon. June 10th, 323 BC. The torches outside the palace cast flickering shadows on the walls, the kind that makes statues move when no one is watching. Inside, Alexander the Great, the conqueror of empires, the architect of a dream that stretched from Greece to India, lies motionless. The fever has taken hold. His skin is hot to the touch, his breath shallow, his voice, once enough to command legions, barely a whisper. He had been drinking, of course. He always drank. The final banquet had been lavish, full of toasts and laughter, of men who had seen too much blood trying to drown their memories in wine. But sometime after the cup was drained, after the laughter faded and the music fell away, Alexander clutched his stomach and cried out in pain. That's how it begins. By the next morning he can't stand. Within days he can't speak. And by the time the royal physicians begin to whisper that the king may not survive, the court is already shifting. You can almost hear it, can't you? That low rustling of ambition. The sudden careful silence of men calculating their next move. A kingdom without a king. A future balanced on the edge of a dying man's breath. And in that silence, a new story is born. Not a eulogy, a theory. He was poisoned. The rumour starts as a whisper. Then it becomes a name, Antipater, a loyal regent entrusted with Europe, now suddenly suspect. His son Iolaus had been the royal cupbearer, the one who handed Alexander the fatal drink, the one who smiled. It spreads quickly, too quickly. Aristotle enters the scene, dragged in by rumour's inertia. He had once tutored Alexander, shaped his mind, praised his ambitions. But that was years ago. Since then, they had grown distant. Worse, Alexander had executed Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes for a perceived slight, a show trial cloaked in royal arrogance. And in ancient courts, slights like that don't go unpunished. According to the storytellers, and they are always busy when kings fall, Aristotle brewed the poison himself. From the waters of the river Styx, a liquid so deadly it could only be stored in the hoof of a mule, carried in secret, passed through conspirators' hands, slipped into Alexander's cup while music played and no one watched. It sounds absurd, and yet it sticks, because how else could a god-king die like this? Not in battle, not by blade, but by fever and silence, reduced, unmade, mortal. Olympias, Alexander's mother, believes it, or pretends to. Her grief sharpens into rage. She has men dragged from their homes, tried in kangaroo courts, executed for treason. She exhumes Iolaus' corpse, scatters his bones. It is vengeance in the shape of justice. But vengeance never ends where it starts. Cassander, Antipater's other son, returns the favour in blood. Olympias is killed, her body left unburied, a warning to anyone who tried to write history with rumour. And still, no truth. The historians of the time are divided. Some dismiss the poisoning as fantasy, others record it as fact. Most hedge their bets, because surviving a Macedonian court means never having a definitive opinion. And centuries later, we still don't know. Malaria, alcohol, old wounds, any of them could have done it. But the conspiracy theory lingers, because it is seductive, because it gives the story structure, meaning, a villain. And because in the power vacuum of a fallen empire, the truth is never as important as the story people choose to believe. There is a moment just after Alexander dies when the silence becomes absolute. The court holds its breath, no proclamations, no orders, just the heavy, humid quiet of a world realizing its axis has vanished. Then everything fractures. The body is still warm when the jockeying begins. Generals, advisors, old friends, old enemies, every man in Babylon knows that a vacuum this large doesn't stay empty for long. And without a clear air, Alexander's empire begins to crack along every fault line it ever had. But it's not just politics at play, it's narrative. The theory of poison gives the chaos a shape. It paints enemies. It suggests betrayal. It casts a shadow long enough to hide a dozen power grabs behind. Cassander leans into it. He strikes first. When Olympias begins arresting those she suspects were part of the conspiracy, Cassander's response is swift. He invades, he besieges, he kills. Not just the queen, but her story, her version of events. He has Hyperides executed, an orator bold enough to propose honouring Iolaus for poisoning Alexander. Cassander doesn't just silence him. He has his tongue cut out before the execution. The message is clear. This isn't about truth, it's about control. And that is the great tragedy of Alexander's death. Not the illness, not the mystery, but the aftermath. The war for what his legacy would mean. Some would remember him as a visionary, a builder of cities and bridges between worlds. Others would see him as a tyrant, drunk on power and divine self-delusion. And then there are those who clung to the idea that he was murdered. Not just killed, but betrayed, because it made him more than a man. It made him a martyr. To be poisoned is to be feared. But to be feared and killed, that's legend. And legends are much easier to wield than facts. So as the empire splinters into Egypt, into Macedon, into Asia, the theory persists. Not because it is true, but because it is useful. Whispers become justification. Allegiances are made and broken in the shadow of a poisoned goblet. Generals claim revenge. Cities swear loyalty to fragments of the myth. And the truth, whatever it once was, is buried beneath the dust kicked up by marching armies. This is what a conspiracy theory does when it takes root in history. It doesn't just survive, it reshapes everything around it. And long after the fever has faded and the torches have gone out, people still look back to that banquet, still ask the same question. Was the king murdered? And just like that, Alexander lives again. Not in body, but in the myth of betrayal, in the story that never dies. Let's turn east now, into the shadows of the Persian Empire, where a single prophet's vision sparked hope, revolution, and a conspiracy so potent it would outlast empires. Mani was not born to be a threat. He was born to heal. Raised in a religious community near Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sasanian Empire, he was a child of devout thinkers and seekers. Yet what he offered the world was more than dogma. It was a system, a cosmic dualism, clean in its logic, seductive in its certainty. Light and darkness, spirit and matter, a universe at war. Mani called it truth. The Persians eventually called it treason. At first he found protection. The Shah of Persia welcomed him. Missionaries were sent across continents, India, Central Asia, even deep into Roman lands. His religion, Manichaeism, grew in secret pockets, bolstered by a rich scripture and a persuasive ethical code. But empires do not share well. As Manichaean influence spread, so did paranoia. To Zoroastrian priests, Mani's teachings were a threat to order. To Rome, they were something worse, a foreign infiltration, wearing the mask of piety, spreading quietly within its own walls. It began as whispers, accusations of heresy, warnings in court scrolls. Then came Diocletian. In 302 AD, the Roman emperor issued one of the most paranoid imperial edicts in history. Manichaeans, he declared, were agents of the Persian enemy, serpents sent to poison Roman virtue. Their religion, a tool of subversion. Their scriptures, bonfires waiting to happen. The persecution wasn't casual, it was systematic. Converts were tortured, leaders were executed, scrolls were burned by the cartload, and the worst part? Much of it was justified not with evidence, but with conspiracy. Diocletian feared what he couldn't see. Cells meeting in private, doctrines that merged East and West, converts in high places. It was espionage wrapped in theology, heresy disguised as truth. And so Manichaeism was outlawed not for its teachings, but for its potential. The idea that it might grow, that it might spread, that it might unify the spiritual fringe into a force large enough to matter. The persecution became a doctrine of its own. Christians, newly empowered, labelled Manichaeans as rivals and infiltrators. The church branded Mani a false prophet, a satanic mirror to Christ. He was arrested, tried, and executed in Persia, flayed alive, his skin stuffed with straw, and displayed like a trophy. But martyrdom didn't stop the movement. The conspiracy had done its job. It made Manichaeism more dangerous by treating it as a threat. Followers went underground. The faith adapted, its language shifted, its rituals went dark, but it didn't disappear. It became the ghost in the Roman machine. Centuries later, Augustine of Hippo, before he became Saint Augustine, was a Manichaean. His eventual rejection of it was vicious and total. He called it madness, a trick, a parasite on truth. But even as he renounced it, he spread its shadow. That's the thing about conspiracies. Even their ashes can smoulder. By the time the empire Christianized fully, Manichaeism had become the ultimate other. Every accusation of hidden cults, devil worship, inverted scripture, it all echoed the language first used to condemn Mani's followers. Manichaeism was no longer just a religion. It was a blueprint for how belief becomes threat. How ideas, once powerful enough, are punished not for what they do, but for what they might become. Rome didn't fear the Manichaeans because they were numerous. It feared them because they were invisible, because they spoke of light and dark in a world that preferred grey, and because every time Rome looked in the mirror, it feared what it saw staring back might not be truth, but reflection. Even centuries later, echoes of Manichaeism haunted church councils, inquisitions, and accusations hurled at any new heresy. Dualism, so neat, so unrelenting, was seductive. It offered a way to explain evil without compromise, a lens to view the world as us versus them, saints versus monsters, light versus dark. This idea seeped quietly into the medieval imagination. Knights fought not just for kings, but against shadows. Heresies were hunted in language that mirrored the dualistic cosmos of Mani, heaven and hell, salvation and damnation. No middle ground. You can still see the outline today in ideologies that split the world clean in two: political, religious, cultural, the legacy of a prophet flayed and feared. And what of the manuscripts, the scriptures burned? A few survived, hidden, translated, rediscovered in dusty libraries and archaeological digs, fragmentary but defiant, pages whispering from beyond the grave. Some were found in Central Asia, scrawled in forgotten tongues, others in Egyptian sands, wrapped like relics. They speak of cosmic war, of light trapped in matter, yearning to return. They speak of discipline, of compassion, of exile, and in each word, a trace of fear, the same fear that made an empire strike first and ask questions never. What might have happened if Mani had lived? If his vision had flourished openly? If Rome had welcomed synthesis instead of sharpening swords? But that's the cost of conspiracy. It doesn't just silence its target, it rewrites the possibility of what could have been. And every time a forgotten sect resurfaces or an ancient scroll is decoded, the empire's fear flickers to life again, as if to say they never really killed the idea. They just buried it and prayed it wouldn't crawl back out. Let's take that reflection into the next conspiracy, the one that rewrote the origins of Christianity itself. Let's head west now, not to Babylon's scorched throne room, but to a sun-baked city where democracy once thrived and paranoia took root overnight. Athens, 415 BC. The Acropolis gleams under a sharp blue sky. Sailors curse at the docks. Philosophers mutter over diluted wine. Merchants hawk olive oil and pottery. The city pulses with purpose and pride. Crowds gather near the assembly to hear news of the impending Sicilian expedition. Rumours flow like wine. But beneath the bustle, an unease lingers, and all eyes are on one man, Alcibiades. Brilliant, charismatic, dangerous, born into nobility, raised among elites, yet always dancing too close to the fire. His speeches electrify the assembly, pulling the masses into his vision. His Olympic victories, he once entered 7 chariots in a single race, are legend. His lovers include aristocrats and enemies alike. His scandals are whispered behind every column. But behind the charisma lies ambition, the kind that doesn't just seek victory, but legacy. It is Alcibiades who champions the expedition to Sicily, promising glory, riches, and the humiliation of Sparta's allies. It is his dream, his crusade. Then on the eve of war, it happens. The statues are defiled, herms, sacred stone guardians placed at doorways and crossroads, topped with the head of Hermes, and marked by their prominent, erect phalluses, are mutilated. Their faces are smashed, features gouged, their virility hacked off. Nearly every single one in the city is defaced in one night. It's not just vandalism, it's spiritual warfare. The timing couldn't be worse. The Sicilian fleet prepares to sail. The entire city is whipped into a fervour of military pride and religious devotion. And now, this? A mass sacrilege? A public desecration that feels like an omen? The city reels. Panic brews in the agora. Priests issue warnings. Citizens clutch amulets. The gods, it seems, have been insulted, just as Athens prepares to tempt fate across the sea. And all of it feels planned. Let's pause, not at the statues, but at the doorstep of suspicion. Because it doesn't take long for public imagination to fixate on a single name. Alcibiades. After all, who else had so much to gain, or lose, from the success of the expedition? Who else could mobilize such a coordinated act? And who else in the long history of Athenian politics has so often blurred the line between statesman and showman? The accusations snowball. Other rumours surface. Alcibiades, it's said, once mocked the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred rituals in Athenian religion. At a private party, dressed as a priest, laughing, drinking, reenacting holy rites in satire. A joke perhaps, but in the court of public opinion, it's heresy. A conspiracy theory is born. Some claim Alcibiades plans to overthrow the democracy, that he's building a shadow cult, a network of elites loyal only to him, that the mutilated herms are more than symbols of insult, they are signals. Ritualistic, timed, coordinated, a warning, a rallying cry. The city, once full of pride, turns inward with suspicion. An investigation is launched, informants are encouraged, prison cells begin to fill, names, hundreds of them, are scribbled onto tablets, some accused by enemies, others by frightened friends. The line between rumour and reality blurs like ink in the rain, and all the while Alcibiades sails to war. He had requested an immediate trial before departure, to face his accusers while he could still defend himself. But the assembly had delayed it. Too risky, they said. Better to wait. Better to send him off, then deal with the mess. So now he's gone. And back in Athens, the paranoia intensifies. Witnesses remember more. Details sharpen in fear. Letters are intercepted. Shadows lengthen. And soon the assembly makes a new decision. Alcibiades must return. Not as a hero, but as a defendant. A herald is dispatched to recall him. Alcibiades receives the summons, and then he disappears. He doesn't return to Athens, doesn't face the court. Instead, he defects to Sparta. Let that settle in your spine. The very architect of Athens' grand expedition, its most persuasive voice, its most visible patriot, now whispers into the ears of its greatest enemy. Why? Guilt? Fear? Strategy? Or had the conspiracy been real all along? Athens doesn't wait for answers. Trials continue. Some accused are executed without ceremony. Others are exiled into poverty and shame. Families are shattered. Trust disintegrates. And across the sea, the war turns grim. The Sicilian expedition becomes a nightmare. Poor planning, internal disputes, naval defeats, a devastating siege, tens of thousands of soldiers die. The fleet is lost. It is one of the greatest military catastrophes in Athenian history. And in the ruins, the conspiracy theory cements. Alcibiades didn't just desecrate statues, he desecrated a future. Except, maybe he didn't. Modern historians remain skeptical. The mutilation of the Herms could have been the drunken prank of elite youths, rowdy, disrespectful, but not treasonous. The reenactment of the mysteries? Perhaps nothing more than an evening gone too far. And Alcibiades? There was never any concrete evidence linking him to either event. But Athens needed a villain. And Alcibiades, arrogant, theatrical, audacious, was perfect. He embodied the tension between elite privilege and democratic suspicion. He acted like a king in a city that had no throne. And when things fell apart, he was the easiest man to blame. The affair of the Herms didn't just deface religious symbols, it fractured the city's faith in itself. The panic revealed something deeper than scandal. It revealed that under the marble skin of democracy, there was fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of enemies within, fear that the very openness of the city could be its undoing. And that fear, once sparked, would not die. In the years that followed, Athens would endure political purges, coups, occupations. Oligarchs would seize power, exiles would return in revenge, democracy would falter and rise again. But the affair of the Herms left a permanent scar, a reminder that the loudest applause can turn into the harshest judgment, that in moments of crisis, even the most rational city can chase ghosts, and that when suspicion becomes policy, the real damage isn't to the statues, it's to the soul of the city. Let's now descend into a different kind of shadow, not the veil of foreign cults or distant prophets, but the veiled chambers of the most sacred places in the ancient world, the temples of prophecy. Welcome to the conspiracy of the oracles. Imagine the oracle of Delphi, shrouded in incense smoke and half-light, her breath shallow as she channels a god. Her voice trembles. Her riddles shape kings' decisions. Empires hinge on her whispers. But what happens when the state begins to fear the very voices it once revered? What if prophecy itself, raw, unfiltered, divine, becomes a threat? In the ancient world, oracles were more than spiritual consultants. They were power brokers. Their cryptic pronouncements could launch wars, crown emperors, or dismantle alliances. For centuries, Greek city-states and Roman officials alike treated them with awe. But behind the piety, unease simmered. The problem? Oracles were unpredictable, independent, untamed. Their messages didn't always align with state interests. They spoke of downfall, corruption, and divine retribution. And in times of political tension, those warnings sounded less like religion and more like rebellion. Rome, master of order, began to tighten its grip. Let's rewind to the Republic. Cicero himself, a statesman and philosopher, once wrote scathingly about oracles. He admired their cultural power, but distrusted their sources. Were they divine or deceptive? By the time of Augustus, the first emperor, the state had already begun to regulate prophetic speech. Not outright bans, but selective silence. Some oracles were favoured, others were buried, literally. Augustus commissioned a review of the Sibylline books, sacred prophecies stored in the temple of Jupiter. Those that didn't align with his regime's vision, destroyed, rewritten, or hidden. It wasn't just about truth, It was about narrative control. The state began forging its own prophecies. State-sponsored seers were installed in key temples, their messages, carefully vetted, conveniently timed. Augustus discovered a prophecy predicting his divine rule. Later emperors would do the same. The line between divine revelation and imperial propaganda blurred. But not all oracles could be tamed. The Oracle of Delphi remained fiercely independent. When Nero visited, she warned of his tyranny. He retaliated, not just with words, but with force. Temple funding was slashed. Priests were replaced. Those who resisted disappeared. Delphi survived, but under watchful eyes. Other centres were less fortunate. Lesser-known prophetic cults, like those of Dodona or Claros, were systematically defunded or dissolved if they voiced dissent. The once sacred became suspect. By the 3rd century, the empire's fear intensified. The crisis of the 3rd century, plagues, invasions, economic collapse, triggered a resurgence in prophecy. People flocked to oracles for answers, and many didn't like what they heard. Oracles warned of Rome's fall, of divine judgment, of emperors unworthy of their crowns. This time, Rome didn't just regulate, it erased. Temples were raided, prophetic scrolls confiscated, independent seers were arrested on charges of sedition, accused of spreading fear, of inciting rebellion, of using gods to challenge Caesar. And so the narrative flipped. Oracles were no longer sacred. They were seditious, dangerous, a network of whispers that threatened the empire's heartbeat. Let's pause here, because what emerged wasn't just suppression. It was a conspiracy theory, crafted by Rome, wielded by emperors, enforced by soldiers. The theory? That rogue oracles were not simply spiritualists. They were agents of chaos, puppets of foreign enemies, sorcerers cloaked in piety. Some emperors went further. Domitian accused his political enemies of consulting oracles in secret to predict and manipulate his downfall. Prophecy became treason, knowledge became crime, and then came Christianity. Early church fathers denounced pagan prophecy. They claimed that oracles were demons in disguise, fallen angels speaking through corrupted tongues. As Christianity rose, the old temples fell. But the suspicion remained. Even within Christianity, the idea of uncontrolled revelation was dangerous. The Montanist movement in the 2nd century, founded by a prophet who claimed direct inspiration from the Holy Spirit, was branded heretical. Why? Because they refused centralized control, because they believed God could still speak outside the church. Rome's old conspiracy, fear of prophecy as power, found a new host. By the time Constantine embraced Christianity, the state had perfected its playbook. Suppress the unpredictable, promote the pliable, use the divine, but only in doses the empire could swallow. The result? A world where prophecy was polished, scripted, tamed. The raw voice of the divine, once feared, once revered, became institutionalized or extinguished. The wildness of the oracle was replaced by the order of the liturgy, the god's whisper replaced by the emperor's decree. And yet fragments survived, in dusty manuscripts, in suppressed sects, in whispered stories passed down in monasteries, because truth has a way of resurfacing. In the 19th century, archaeologists uncovered inscriptions from suppressed temples, prayers etched into stone, records of prophecies erased from public memory. In Delphi, they found altars once thought destroyed. In the East, texts that had been banned for centuries re-emerged. And the voice of the oracle, though faint, began to echo once more. Let's end with this. The ancient world didn't just silence oracles because they were wrong. They silenced them because they were right too soon. Because they spoke of collapse when the empire wanted triumph. Because they saw cracks in the marble before anyone dared admit they were there. And in every conspiracy born from fear, the same truth lingers. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can say is what everyone secretly knows, even if you say it in riddles, even if you whisper it through smoke, even if you wear a veil. Let's descend now, not into a city or a battlefield, but into the cold, shadow-drenched catacombs that lie beneath the imperial heart of Rome, into those narrow stone corridors where the flicker of oil lamps barely pierces the gloom, and faint, ancient songs echo softly off the walls, sung by trembling voices that once belonged to men and women who would shape the destiny of an empire without ever lifting a sword. Here, among the damp rock and the quiet dead, the earliest Christians gathered, not as revolutionaries or preachers, but as survivors, whispering their faith in hushed voices. Not because it was weak, but because it was not yet safe. In the first century, Christianity was not yet a movement. It was a murmur, a fragile thread of hope passed quietly from one person to another, mouth to ear, heart to heart, a story of resurrection, of a man who had risen from death, a promise that the world itself could be remade, not through violence, but through belief. But in Rome, even a murmur can provoke a storm. The empire, in all its sprawling tolerance, had little patience for stubborn gods. It could adopt Egyptian rites, Persian fire temples, Gallic spirits, and still maintain its order, so long as one essential rule was obeyed. All gods must kneel beneath the shadow of Rome's divine hierarchy. One could believe anything, but one must still burn incense to the emperor, must bow to the altar of Jupiter, must participate in the rituals that bound citizen to state. The Christians, however, refused. They did not merely abstain from these gestures of civic piety, they denounced them. They refused to offer sacrifices, not just to the emperor, but to any god but their own. They rejected the pantheon entirely, calling it false, and more dangerously, they refused to pretend otherwise, even under pressure, even under torture. To Roman eyes, this wasn't just piety, it was a defiant act of political rebellion. What began as confusion quickly curdled into suspicion. Rumours flourished in the vacuum of understanding, whispered by those who feared what they could not observe. People spoke of Christians gathering in secret, holding their rituals in the dead of night. They heard whispers of blood drinking, not understanding the symbolic language of the Eucharist. They heard them call each other brother and sister, and imagined orgiastic rites in the darkness. Their refusal to participate in festivals, in feasts, in mourning rites was interpreted not as modesty, but as malice. And so Rome, with all its might, began to see not a religion, but a cult, not worshippers, but conspirators. Then came the fire. In 64 AD, flames engulfed Rome. The inferno consumed homes, temples, markets, choking the sky with smoke and ash. Nero, the emperor whose vanity demanded a scapegoat, needed someone to blame. And he found them not in rebels or generals, but in the Christians. He accused them of arson, of orchestrating the destruction of Rome itself. The punishment that followed was not just cruel, it was theatrical, a performance of imperial wrath. Christians were dipped in oil and set ablaze to light Nero's gardens at night. Others were sewn into the skins of wild beasts and thrown to dogs. Some were crucified, not in mockery of their faith, but to echo its horror. Martyrdom was born, in these moments, not as a theological ideal, but as a spectacle, a public attempt to extinguish belief through pain and humiliation. Yet it failed. Rather than erasing Christianity, it etched it deeper into memory, into legend. The more Rome punished, the more powerful the story became, of believers who forgave their executioners, who sang as they died, who met death not with terror, but with radiant conviction. Even as bodies fell, the faith rose. Still, suspicion remained, calcified into policy over decades. Christianity remained illegal, not only because it defied doctrine, but because it challenged the very fabric of civic life. Rome's gods were not merely spiritual figures, they were the architecture of empire, the ritual glue of state, the symbolic assurance that the emperor ruled not by sword alone, but by divine right. To refuse the gods was to refuse the empire, and that made every Christian, regardless of creed, class, or conduct, a potential traitor. Under emperors like Domitian and Trajan, the law became clear. Accusation alone could justify punishment. If you confessed your faith, you were executed. If you denied it, you might live, but your name would bear the mark of disloyalty. Even Rome's intellectuals joined in the suspicion. Tacitus called the faith a deadly superstition. Pliny the Younger, unsure how to proceed, asked the emperor whether belief itself should be punished, or merely the actions it inspired. But the question was never really about belief. It was about fear. Rome feared what Christians represented, a network of loyalty outside the state, a community that transcended class, ethnicity, and law, a body that bowed not to Caesar, but to a crucified foreigner, and believed that his death had broken the world's chains. In the 3rd century, that fear became imperial mandate. Under Decius, every citizen was required to make a public sacrifice to the gods. Refusal meant death. Clergy were targeted, scriptures were burned, cemeteries, sacred places where communities mourned and remembered, were confiscated or destroyed. And yet the church, pressed from every side, endured. Like roots under paving stones, it adapted, spread, strengthened. Bishops communicated across provinces. Letters from imprisoned believers became scripture in their own right. Underground churches flourished, bound by secrecy, sacrifice, and unshakable hope. Let us pause, because what Rome unleashed was not mere intolerance, it was the machinery of conspiracy. The Christians were cast not just as deviants, but as agents of destabilization. Secret meetings, foreign origins, coded rituals, these were all reinterpreted through the lens of fear. The empire needed order. The Christians represented mystery, and mystery to power always looks like menace. In Diocletian's great persecution, this paranoia reached its peak. The empire attempted to root out Christianity entirely, but the faith had already embedded itself too deeply in the hearts of slaves, merchants, soldiers, and senators alike. The flame that was meant to burn it out only made it visible. And then, in the most unimaginable reversal, came Constantine. A single emperor's vision, a cross in the sky, transformed centuries of persecution into imperial policy. The Edict of Milan legalized Christianity. The faith once feared and hunted was now protected, promoted, and soon privileged. But with power comes temptation, and those who had once been pursued would learn to pursue in turn. The machinery of persecution, its tools, its language, its instincts, did not vanish. It changed hands. For now, though, what matters is this. Christianity survived not by the sword, but by its refusal to submit. It endured because it whispered instead of shouted, because it believed when belief was a sentence of death. Rome saw that silence and mistook it for sedition, but it was something far more dangerous. It was faith, quiet, patient, unbreakable. Let's turn now to Egypt, a land where sunlight slants through temple columns like blades, where gods wear animal heads, where tombs speak in riddles and papyrus whispers, secrets into desert winds. This is not just the land of pyramids and pharaohs, but of hidden knowledge, encrypted belief, and eventually of a philosophical conspiracy buried under sand and fire. Here in Alexandria, knowledge was once a civic virtue. The library, before it burned, was more than a building. It was ambition in marble and scroll. It sought to house every text, every truth, and for a time it almost did. But what happens when knowledge questions power? Enter Gnosticism. Not a religion in the traditional sense, not a sect, but a current. A whisper of belief that cut against the orthodoxy, rising from Rome and the institutional church. A theology that didn't just ask different questions, but questioned the questioners themselves. Where Christianity offered salvation through faith, Gnosticism offered salvation through knowledge. Gnosis, secret insight, inner revelation, an awakening that didn't require a priest, a church, or an emperor's blessing. To a believer, this was liberation. To the empire, it was a threat. Let's rewind a few centuries. After the birth of Christianity, but before its ascendance to power, the Roman Empire stood on a tightrope. It was sprawling, multi-ethnic, polytheistic, and perpetually anxious. New ideas weren't always welcome, especially when they arrived cloaked in mystery and contradiction. And Gnosticism was contradiction made flesh. Its cosmology was radical. The physical world, it taught, was not a gift from a loving creator, but a trap, a mistake, a creation not of the true God, but of a lesser, ignorant deity, the demiurge. This demiurge wasn't Satan exactly, but it wasn't divine love either. It was control, ego, empire. Do you see the problem? Rome believed its power was sanctioned by heaven. The church, emerging, growing, increasingly centralized, believed creation was good, that God was just, and that salvation came through obedience and faith. But the Gnostics said, no. They said God was not who you think. They said matter itself was corrupt. They said the true God existed beyond this world, and that you could find him not through dogma, but through inner awakening. And worst of all, they didn't just say it, they wrote it. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Apocryphon of John. Texts that reshaped familiar stories. In one, Jesus laughs at his crucifixion. In another, Mary Magdalene is the chief apostle. In still others, the divine spark inside each human must be discovered, fanned and freed, not simply forgiven. These weren't just alternate scriptures, they were theological dynamite. And so began the counterstrike. The church labelled them heresy, dangerous deviations from the truth, threats to unity. And unity was the church's foundation. One God, one faith, one scripture, one path. The Gnostics rejected all four. Rome, now Christian under Constantine and his successors, wielded its new power not only to spread the gospel, but to prune it. Canonization wasn't just theological, it was political. Every accepted gospel was a line drawn in the sand. Every rejected text was an enemy branded. The Gnostics, they became the buried. Their communities were scattered, their scrolls hidden in caves and jars, their teachings banished from cathedrals and seminaries, and with time the silence thickened. But conspiracies don't die in silence, they ferment in it. Whispers remained. From bishops who hinted at those who claimed secret knowledge, from councils that debated whether even to mention their existence, from theologians like Irenaeus, who penned entire volumes refuting them, perhaps fearing that silence gave them power. And then came 1945. In the Egyptian desert near Nag Hammadi, a farmer unearthed a jar. Inside, a library, pages weathered but legible, a whole spectrum of lost voices. Suddenly the Gnostics were not theory, they were testimony. Their words, long thought burned, now breathed again. And with their return came the uncomfortable realization: history had been edited. Let's pause. This isn't to suggest that Gnosticism was truer than orthodoxy. that its texts are more authentic, but rather this, the idea that belief itself was once broader, stranger, and more diverse than we were taught. The early centuries of Christianity were not harmonious. They were fractious, eclectic, and fiercely contested. What emerged as orthodoxy was not the only voice. It was the voice that won. But winning is not the same as silencing. In the Nag Hammadi texts, we hear cries of frustration, awe, revelation. We hear a different Christianity, not focused on sin, but on sleep, not asking for forgiveness, but for awakening. The Gnostics didn't reject Jesus, they revered him, but they saw him as a guide, not a gate, a revealer, not a redeemer. And perhaps most dangerously, they believed that truth was personal, that salvation was solitary, that every believer had the capacity to reach divine understanding without a priest, a sacrament, or a church. To institutions of power, that's heresy of the worst kind. Because it's not just disobedience, it's independence. Let's return to Egypt one last time. The scrolls lie on a scholar's table now, not hidden in clay, but translated, digitized, debated. Seminaries study them. Universities host lectures. Documentaries dissect their metaphors. But still, they carry the weight of conspiracy. Because even now the idea of forbidden scripture tantalizes. The idea that something true was hidden, that knowledge was buried, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. Maybe it wasn't dangerous to the soul, but it was dangerous to control. And that's how you know it was a conspiracy, not from the violence it provoked, but from the silence it imposed. Gnosticism wasn't erased because it was evil. It was erased because it was untamed. And so this chapter too becomes a mirror. Ask yourself, what truths do we bury today? What insights, unsettling or inconvenient, are dismissed not because they're false, but because they're free? And when the next farmer digs up the next forgotten jar, will we listen or burn it again? Let's talk about another chapter of ancient chaos. Same empire, different flavour of divine drama, but the conspiracies still absolutely unhinged. Hey, you know what's weirder than a king who thought he was a god? A king who changed all the gods, erased centuries of religion overnight, and then mysteriously vanished from history like he never existed. Yeah. Tonight we're talking about Akhenaten, Egypt's heretic pharaoh, the guy who may have invented monotheism 1,300 years before Jesus, built a new capital from scratch, and then got wiped out so thoroughly they literally carved his face out of every wall they could find. You wake up in a half-built city called Akhenaten. It's not even 5 years old, and it's already crumbling. The wind smells like limestone dust and crushed flowers from the temple offerings. You're a builder, a scribe, a priest, doesn't matter. What matters is that you live under the rule of a strange skinny man with sunken cheeks, a long skull, and eyes that always look like he's listening to something no one else can hear. His name is Akhenaten, and he's changed everything. Forget Ra, forget Osiris. The old gods are gone, banned, erased. There's only one god now, Aten, the sun disk. No face, no myths, just light, just heat, just the blinding power of the sun, and the guy who says he speaks to it directly. And that guy, he's making enemies by the hour. The priests of Amun, furious. The generals, suspicious. The people, confused. Half the kingdom thinks Akhenaten is enlightened. The other half thinks he's insane. But here's where it gets shady. One day, Akhenaten disappears from the records. No funeral, no tomb, no official cause of death, just gone. And suddenly, there's a new pharaoh, a boy, 10 years old, his name, Tutankhaten. But pretty soon he changes it to Tutankhamun. The Amun is back, the old gods are back. The sun disk cult, bulldozed. Akhenaten city, is abandoned and left to rot in the desert. You hear whispers that Akhenaten was murdered, that his body was dumped in a ditch, that the priests finally had enough and corrected history. Some believe his own court turned on him, maybe even Nefertiti, his queen, who vanishes from records too. Maybe she ruled for a bit in disguise, maybe not. We don't know, because someone erased every page of the script. Imagine it. You're sweeping the temple steps and you notice a carving of Aten has been hacked off the wall. Where once was a golden sun is now just gouged out limestone. The gods are back, but not all of them, only the ones that play nice. Akhenaten's new religion had no myths, no bedtime stories, no afterlife comforts, just fire, light, a faceless sun glaring down on you like it's judging everything you do. And maybe that's why he had to go. The old priests wanted power. The people wanted comfort. Akhenaten offered neither. He gave them austerity and abstraction. And they responded the way people always do when their faith gets rewritten by royal decree, with a quiet but unstoppable rage. So was it a holy coup? A religious assassination? Or did the gods themselves decide they'd had enough? Nobody knows. But here's what you do know. The statues are smashed, the temples are silent, and the name Akhenaten, it's forbidden. You go back to work, back to your crumbling house in a dead city, and you wonder how long before someone comes to make sure you forget too. But for today, you remember. And in ancient Egypt, that's rebellion enough. Final thought, history doesn't just happen. It's sculpted, in stone, in silence, in stories we half remember, and ones they tried to bury. The powerful rarely fall without a little push. And in every kingdom, beneath every golden throne, there's always a dark room full of whispers. So here we are, staring at shadows painted on the walls of time, trying to decode what happened and why it keeps happening. Power doesn't just attract corruption, it breeds secrets, and secrets in ancient empires didn't leak. They screamed in silence. The more we look, the more we realise the real conspiracies weren't just in the poisoning or the coups or the vanishing kings. They were in the decisions made behind thick curtains, with oil lamps burning low, where history's villains and victors looked exactly the same, just depending on whose version made it out alive. And maybe the most unsettling part, some of them didn't even need to be erased. They simply faded. Because silence, like sand, swallows everything if you wait long enough. So what's the takeaway, wandering historian of the internet? First, question the clean endings. If the story wraps too neatly, someone was probably silenced. Second, power loves legacy, but fears truth. And that fear has a habit of rewriting everything it touches. Third, there's always another body under the palace. Always. History isn't a textbook, it's a graveyard, and every so often, if you listen closely, something buried starts whispering back. So whether it's a god-king rotting too slowly in Babylon, or a sun worshipper erased from time in Thebes, one thing's always true. The official story is just the version that survived. Stay curious, stay skeptical, dig deeper, and maybe, just maybe, don't trust anyone wearing a crown. Catch you in the next conspiracy. Sleep well.